Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I'm Tyler Donohue. He is Sean Fitz, Lance Glenn alongside as producer. We're coming to you on a Monday night, fresh off of the first day of spring practice here at Penn State. We were on the field for a bit for that spring practice period. We got back to Beaver Stadium's media room for the first time since February of 2020 to have a chance to ask several questions of James Franklin, a very lengthy press conference kicking off spring ball. We're back to summarize some things, have some takeaways, talk a little bit about recruiting. There's some transfer visitors on campus as well during the weekend. But of course, Sean, we begin with the obvious. The pads are back. The football is back out on the field. And session number 1 of 15 for spring ball is now in the books.
Yeah, and it doesn't get much more beautiful than it was today in Happy Valley. I mean, we went out there, expecting to get into Haluba Hall for, that's kind of how we roll with spring practice sometimes. We were outside today. Everything was great. It's just great to see football going on again. Obviously, we're here for football year round, but when those 15 practices hit, it's something special. So it was pretty cool to see that, and not a ton that we could take away from the actual practice session. A lot of special teams work, a lot of fumble security drills and things like that, but no active football, I guess you would call it. With 11 on 11, 7 on 7 or anything like that. So, but yeah, it was just good to see them out there. There's things that pop up to you just sort of automatically when you're looking at this team. That's strength in numbers and not so much strength in numbers at certain positions. We talked about that with James Franklin today, talking about linebacker, talking about offensive line, just storylines that we've talked about all offseason. We're going to continue to talk about it. But when you see it there in front of you, when you check out those those listings, or you see the depth chart that we have, then it's just it hits you right in the face, kind of.
And we saw some old faces out there on the field. Some of the guys are going to be testing this Thursday for the pro day. Jesse Lucchetta was over by the defensive lineman. Jahan Dotson was roaming around the field. Jordan Stout over with the specialists. But it was the new faces that always command attention here on the start of spring ball. There are nine additions from the recruiting class. You've got one from junior college and JB Nelson, an offensive lineman. We'll talk about him and how he may factor in just a moment. He had the 8 freshmen as well, graduating high school mid-year, coming to campus. That's headlined by the 5 stars, one at quarterback in Drew Aller, one at running back in Nicholas Singleton. But their first chance to get their feet wet out on the practice field. Winter conditioning, a big proving ground. Some guys excelled there. We've talked about that a bit. But now you're going toe-to-toe with 3rd, 4th, 5th, and now 6th year, in some cases, veterans at the college football level. And this is when you start to get a bit of a jolt and then adjust if you're that first-year player. And remember, a lot of these guys, normal circumstances, they'd be in high school getting ready for prom right now.
And it's funny when you look at some of these guys and you think how big they actually are and how big they're listed and things like that. Then all of a sudden they put the pads on and they go out and stand beside their guy, the guys at the same position that are a couple years older. I look at Zane Duran. I was watching the defensive line, and Zane's not a very big guy. I mean, he's 6'1", 260. I think 265 is what James Franklin said earlier today when he was asked about him in his press conference. So he doesn't jump off the page in terms of like mass or size or anything like that, but it's just funny to see Drew Aller out there and Nick Singleton, guys that are bigger than their classmates, but you put them on a field of for lack of a better term, grown men, and they certainly stand out in a different way. So you'll see that. You'll see guys that are just getting their feet wet, getting a little bit behind, just a step behind in drills because they're trying to figure out how a college practice goes. And I think they'll get up to speed and they'll be fine. It's a good group that they have here so far. I was watching some of the special teams drills, guys like Amari Evans, that, you can see some of these traits that we've talked about for the longest time. Now it's time to put them into action, but you see some of these traits sort of stand out amongst this group.
Just traits that stood out from that group. Nick Singleton, a little bit of burst there. You got a sneak peek. Nothing, as you said, no contact, no 11 on 11. Really just trying to get the handoff, the exchange down between quarterbacks and running backs. But you see when he hits the open field a little bit, he can scoot, and that's something we can't wait to see against a live-action defense, hopefully over the course of the spring at some point. And then while while Drew Aller has a ways to go in filling out that frame, Sean, you look over at that quarterback group, and we talked about where it was at the end of last regular season, not in a good spot. Right now, you see Bo Perbula added, Christian Veilleux with another offseason of work, but Drew looks a little bit different than any quarterback this team has brought in since I've covered the program. They've had some really impressive athletes come to town, but you look at the stature with which, measuring up against some of the other guys, including the 23-year-old Sean Clifford, it's easy to take notice of number 15 in that regard.
I don't know if people realize how big he is, like how tall he is. I saw him a couple of weeks ago. They had something up at the stadium, and he walked through with some of his teammates, and he's a good head taller than Nick Singleton. I mean, he's kind of like it's kind of like Trevor Lawrence. You don't expect him to be 6'5" plus, but just that much taller. He looks like a typical quarterback, the 6'4" guy, but he's got some size to add to that. But yeah, he's different. I mean, you look at Sean Clifford, and Sean Clifford is sort of average physically. Christian Veilleux maybe a little bit bigger, and then Bo Prabula, probably just a smidge shorter than them. By the way, 2 number 9s. That'll be fun to watch come blue-white game. Christian Veilleux sticking with number 9 right now. Bo Prabula with number 9. But Drew is definitely, he stands out in a physical and sort of metaphorical way when you're talking about stature among those quarterbacks.
We got a lot of intel on the offensive line today, at least how things are shaping up as spring practice begins. You've got all these practices to kind of sort through possibilities. You've got Hunter Norzad coming in, the Cornell transfer in May. But James Franklin went to a place that we don't usually get to go to with him in this press conference and gave us the 2 deep for the offensive line on day 1 of spring ball, and take it for what it's worth right now. But let's just quickly go through that first team first, Sean. It's really what you have been projecting throughout this offseason. It's something that's come up in conversation here quite a bit during the podcast, of course. You need 3 new starters. You need to get a lot better in terms of performance. Here's what James Franklin says they plan to roll out first team, first practice. It's Olu Fashanu at left tackle, Landon Tengwall at left guard, Juice Scruggs at center, Salim Wormley at right guard, and Caden Wallace at right tackle. Wormley out there in pads today, Sean. Not quite sure how much he will be a participant over the course of the spring, but the fact that he suffered a preseason injury last August, and here we are in March, and he's being mentioned aloud as a first teamer right now at right guard, I think that's a very strong indication of optimism.
Yeah, it's the big thing to take away from this. I mean, we did this last week or 2 weeks ago on the site, and it's exactly what we projected, with the caveat that you wanted to see Salim Wormley see how much he could do this spring and see if he can get out there. And there's no reason to push him and get further ahead than he needs to be. But just to see him out there at right guard, because I think it's obviously a better option. You've got Golden Israel Chumba listed behind him. You've also got Alex Fermanek, who was a defensive tackle, who was formerly a walk-on as a linebacker, I believe. But he's a big, strong kid. You had to throw him over there just to help with numbers, because numbers, they stand out in a bad way. We'll say that. You look at the amount of guys that they have, not only scholarship, but only 1 or 2 walk-on guys as well. They're going to be struggling to field some units this year, this spring, as they continue to go on. I think a lot of that goes back to Bryce Effner. He wasn't out there for the Outback Bowl. He wasn't out there for the end of the season. We didn't see him out there today, and that changes some things. You're going to have Jimmy Christ go from a backup right tackle to a backup left tackle, have Ibrahim Traoré slide out as a backup right tackle. And then you've got guys like JB Nelson and Nick Dawkins backing up in the interior. Very, very thin, very inexperienced in that second team, but this is the time for those guys to grow up.
As of right now, with Traoré and Christ, your 2 second-team tackles who've been on campus a couple of years each, 1 college game played combined. You had Jimmy Christ enter for that Rutgers matchup last year when the team was dealing with flu issues. Traoré has never gotten into an Indy Lions contest, and as of right now, potentially 1 snap away, 1 moment away from being called upon at tackle. Although Franklin did note here, while we didn't hear about Wallace moving to guard, Franklin mentioned Wallace being a guy they see as a tackle on both sides. So something to keep in mind when you talk about depth, and if one guy were to go down, if something were to happen to Fashanu, they see Wallace as a guy who could play left tackle if they need him to. Right tackle is his home, as it was last year and as it was at the end of his redshirt freshman year. I think you circle Caden Wallace as a guy who individually, if he can make that kind of progress, man, will that go a long way collectively for this group. But there's a lot of holes to fill, and you look down that 2 deep, it's a lot of those 2020 signings that we've discussed on. 5 offensive linemen in that class, 1 projected to start right now in year 3 in Olu Fashanu. You go through this list, though. Chris, the second-team left tackle. Dawkins, the second-team center. Golden Israel Achumba, second-team right guard. And Traoré, the second-team right tackle. I know that this isn't a group that Phil Troutwine was involved in recruiting, but that's the group that he inherited in year one. That's the group that had to wait around during the pandemic to actually get out on the practice field. And here they are a couple of years later. They're really at the crux of the present and the future for this offensive line, because if too many of these guys fizzle out, you're in a really bad spot. And if you hit on a few more of these guys, maybe we were figuring going into the spring, well, then that could help stabilize things for you. But as usual with this offensive front and what we've got ahead in the 14 practices, Phil Troutwine has a lot of work to do, and their most notable addition to the roster this year on the offensive front, we think, Hunter Norzad, he won't be around until summer.
Yeah, and the good news is there's a lot of room for growth and potential, or growth and progress there on the offensive line. The bad news is there's a lot of room for growth and progress there, because they've got a long ways to go for some of those guys that have not played much football at all, and we'll see where they're at. And Norzad coming in is encouraging to add depth and talent, but that's a thin unit to begin with. It's a talent deficient unit to begin with as well. So you've got plenty of questions there for Phil Troutwine, and like last season, they're not going to go away quickly.
And last season, Wormley sounded like the guy who was going to win the starting job at left guard, where you ultimately had the Ivy League transfer taking over for the duration of the regular season after the first couple possessions of week one. Wormley now on campus ahead of another Ivy Leaguer. We'll see what he can make of this spring ball. As we said, though, it's fair to wonder just how much he can accomplish physically. What kind of pace will Penn State set for him? And then you apply that to the two guys that are, been in a lot of spotlight for us on the defensive line, Adisa Isaac, Hakeem Beamon. I think some people forget, Sean, that Hakeem Beamon did spend last year with the team. He practiced with the team. Adisa Isaac attended practices, but not dressed, not competing, as he recovered from an offseason injury, a non-football related injury. Now they're both back. James Franklin saying both are special players and both can make an impact, but he's very careful to categorize them separately, and I think that's important.
Yeah, he went out of his way. Obviously, last year, Adisa showed up on the injury. I don't want to say injury report because Penn State doesn't do one, but it was obvious that he was injured. Beeman dealing with some off the field stuff that he had to work through. Some maturity comments there from James Franklin today. Some comments about his focus and his trajectory, and again, tremendously talented guy. I mean, this is a guy that you want in your defensive line rotation, but he's got to get there. On the other hand, you've got to get a fully healthy, fully healed Adisa Isaac there. So you've got two sort of divergent storylines with these guys, but they're going to be intertwined because they were absent in 2021. But yeah, both of these guys could go a long way. We saw Adisa Isaac, obviously limited. Obviously, they're trying to hold him back, which is the right way to go about it. There's no reason to throw him out there. Like I said, there's no games in the spring to win that Adisa Isaac can help you win. But he was out there going through drills and things like that today. That was good to see. And Hakeem seems physically ready to go. He's playing on the interior as we projected him to do for over a year now. So hopefully he can do what he needs to do to stay on track to be that guy to help that rotation, because those guys, we've seen it with the defensive line in the past. Just every body that you need, you have to have on deck, and those guys are talented players, and you want the more of those guys available.
I know your biggest takeaway on the defensive line was the sad case of Jordan Vandenberg cutting his hair before spring camp. And although he didn't pop off the field, again, what we saw was we didn't see much, but certainly has been popping in a lot of ways for this coaching staff. Is Zane Durant once again brought his name up to James Franklin during the press conference today, and he ran with it, saying he feels Zane Durant is trending toward, quote, an unusual role. And he calls it an unusual role because you just don't see defensive tackles hit the Power 5 level, work their way into being contributors immediately. And it sounds like Zane Durant, at least through his first few months on campus, with a big stretch ahead of him here on the practice field, is poised to potentially do that. And no true freshman defensive tackle here has burned redshirt status since PJ Mustipher, who was a top 100 prospect, has gone on to be an all Big Ten player. And with Durant, pushing 270 pounds now, Sean, according to James Franklin, showed up at around 260, I believe. He's adding weight. They think he's going to carry it well. And all the testing that we talked about, that's all great. And that was tremendous for the start of his career, laying the foundation of this buzz. Now here comes the next phase, going up against these offensive linemen, getting the critiques from guys like John Scott and Dion Barnes and Manny Diaz and veterans, and then applying that. You just continue to hear him pop up. When James Franklin goes on and on about this young man, once again, a few hours before his first college football practice, that does stand out because James Franklin, quite tight-lipped when it comes to players who haven't proven much on the field yet.
Yeah, you look at his trajectory this offseason, and we put that report out in, I think, January about how he was standing out, and then it started as a groundswell of people asking about him and things like that. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves and say this kid, he's a freshman defensive tackle. They don't play. This is what happens with freshman defensive tackle. And then I was talking to some people in the program. I think I said this on the show a couple of weeks ago, and they're like, yeah, he's going to crack that rotation. He's going to try and crack that rotation at least. And, all right, man, I'll take you for your word. It seems like James Franklin is ready to say these things. And I think, a lot of the things that James Franklin says measured, and I don't want to say predetermined, but he thinks about these things before he goes into that media room. And when asked about Zane Durant, he says he's got a chance to have an unusual role. Then he, of course, compared him to Kevin Givens, as we often do, and it kind of makes sense from there. But yeah, just seeing him, we didn't get too many good shots of him because he was basically standing in a crowd today at practice. But he's going to have to add some size to be consistent. But at the same time, does he have to be consistent for 25 snaps, 30 snaps? No, he doesn't. He's a freshman guy that you can rotate in there, and maybe you can get him in for a few plays and he can do some good things at defensive tackle. So I don't know, man. It's one of those things where you don't want to put the cart before the horse, but when James Franklin comes out and says that this guy can have a role day one or year one or whatever it may be with this defense, I think that's worth listening to.
Yeah, up from Florida and off to a fast start, and kind of speaking about James Franklin's reluctance to throw too much praise or too much spotlight on a guy who hasn't participated in a practice yet. You saw a little bit of that when Nick Singleton and Drew Aller were asked about during the press conference today. One thing that happened at the quarterback spot, he said, it's going to be important to get these guys reps for evaluation at quarterback. Some days that might mean that Sean gets to step to the side and have one of those veteran days, and Christian Veillou's getting some reps with the one, and you got Drew and Bo maybe going 2 and 3. Right now, it sounds like rotating at 3 and 4. That's what you'd expect for the 2 early enrolled freshmen. And then Singleton, you put him in with the other freshmen, Katron Allen, top 24/7 prospect coming to campus. The guys who are back here, Keziah Holmes, Kevon Lee, Devin Ford, Franklin kind of showing some respect to the guys who have been here, but also saying that to this point, both Allen and Singleton have checked off the boxes as blue chip kind of prospects. And as I said, just a little flash here and there, getting a chance to see Nick Singleton on this practice field, quickly standing out just with that burst. Again, I think there's not really a lot of running backs who can step onto a campus and you can say that guy was definitely a 5-star coming to campus, because really only 5-stars do that, Sean. We've seen a bunch of running backs show up here, even the guys who are high 4-stars and guys who are top 2 prospects. It takes a while for them to kind of gain that footing. Singleton, the number 1 ranked recruit at running back in the entire nation by 24/7 Sports. Not saying he's going to go light the world on fire on this practice field, but I think you will see some separation just in terms of that innate natural talent. And then we'll see what J1 Slater can do with it.
Yeah, and you look at the positions where guys can make an early impact, and running back is certainly right up there. As a freshman, he can come in and play, and he has that opportunity to do so. And on top of that, that room can use an extra reset, or he can use a reset button to get started again. So we'll see what happens with Singleton. James Franklin was asked in his press conference today about resetting the running game itself and what you can do to things, and they know it was not good enough, and they know that they need to do some things. And Mike Yursich was one of those. Had one of those self-scouting moments where he was kind of the guy ahead of the curve saying, hey, this stuff's not working. We got to figure something else out. What they do with that, it remains to be seen, because that's a very big question. Mike Yursich, there's a lot of pressure on him this offseason to deliver upon the hype that was bestowed upon him. And based on his previous stops, he certainly hasn't had too many years where he's having the criticism that he's having right now. So it'll be interesting to see how they bounce back. And on top of the running game stuff, you're talking about the continuity with Sean Clifford in the second offseason with Mike Yursich, how everything is coming about. And really, after watching last season, can't wait to see any sign of improvement there, because that was tough to watch by the end of the year last year. So hopefully everything that they're saying is going to come to fruition, and they'll be able to work through some of these problems.
Yeah, Franklin mentioned a few of those positional coaches, aside from Mike Yursich, as guys who stepped up and took responsibility, accountability, and trying to fix this thing. You mentioned Ty Howell, tight ends coach, Jaywan Sider, the running backs coach, of course. And we'll see. At this point, I feel like James Franklin could pretty much promise just about anything from this ground game. And until we see it take shape in September, it's going to be a hard time for people to put 2 feet on the bandwagon and buy into this rushing attack, taking a huge step forward. But it's going to have to happen if Penn State wants to get to where they need to be. And also to validate Mike Yursich coming on board, as you said, and as James Franklin said, that was not did not meet or exceed any expectations they had for year one. And of course, now same quarterback, same offensive coordinator. Been a while since that happened at Penn State. Will that pay off, and how might it pay off? Over on defense, Sean, linebacker. We've talked about this. It's an area that needs to be addressed.
Have we?
Well, the 2 names that we've talked about quite a bit at Mike linebacker, that's where James Franklin went. Kobe King, year 2, Tyler Elsdon, year 3. And he threw in this caveat, though, after talking about King and Elsdon and sharing a bunch of reps and splitting reps and getting evaluated hard at the Mike role. He's not here yet, but James Franklin stating Abdul Carter, the 4-star linebacker who signed with Penn State back in December, they feel like among every prospect they signed in the 2022 class, he may have had the best senior season. And there were some heck of a senior seasons when you look at some of these dudes that just joined the program.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Abdul Carter, and the first thing that jumps out to you is says he's going to play in the box. He's going to be a linebacker when he gets here, because we've talked about him being an eventual edge player, though. I think that's one thing to take into account here. The second thing is you look at the guys that he mentioned before, Kobe King and Tyler Elsdon. These are guys that were sort of, known as good instinct guys, being in the right position, maybe lack a little bit athletically, a little bit different. That's kind of the flip side with Abdul Carter. Abdul Carter's off the charts athletically, but he's never been asked to read and react and do all those kind of things. So that's an interesting thing to me, is when you're talking about projecting who's going to be your Mike. And I don't see Abdul Carter being the starter or anything as a freshman, but who's going to be your Mike? You have this super athletic guy that hasn't played the position all that much against these guys that have been essentially lifetime linebackers and really good players and really good things, but maybe don't have the dynamic athletic ability. And that'll be something that's interesting to watch, because I know Penn State fans are pretty frustrated at times with the way that it's come out. And you've had some freak athletes at linebacker that maybe haven't, you're looking at Brandon Smith, a guy that, you thought was a combination of both, and he was more athletic than instinctual. And you have questions about whether or not this guy whether or not one of these guys that's super athletic can actually deliver. That's a big question mark that I think Penn State fans have. So I'll be interested to track that. But for now, I mean, you look at that and you're talking about a true freshman that's not even on campus yet as a potential answer for you at linebacker. That says something about where you're at there, because you've got Curtis Jacobs backed up probably by Charlie Catcher, who hasn't played a ton of football here, Kobe King and Tyler Elson. Then you get out to the Sam position, or the field position. I'm not even sure if they're still calling it the Sam, but you got Jonathan Sutherland, you've got Jamari Budden. Yeah, you're looking pretty thin at that spot.
Yeah, we did hear about Sutherland. In case there was any one wondering about his status, he will be playing that field backer role, that Sam linebacker. The question is, how often will we see Sutherland or any third linebacker out there? The fifth defensive back has been discussed quite a bit. It's a bit of a hallmark with the 3 safeties. Sean, when you kind of line up this linebacker depth, and then what we see maybe being a bit of a luxury with what you have at defensive back compared to the rest of your defensive roster. We talked about this quite a bit, getting guys like Daquan Hardy on the field, and I think you probably start to add other names to that list. John Dixon, Zakee Wheatley, now shifted over to safety. These players, compelling prospects. Jonathan Sutherland, year 6, I would say among fans, maybe one of the more less compelling players on this roster. I think people feel like they have him figured out. How do you balance those two things? Maybe the deficiency at linebacker and a potential surplus at defensive back. It would seem to be an equation that maybe can work in Manny Diaz's favor.
That's a very good question. I don't have the answer, because as you mentioned, Jonathan Sutherland, I think what you're getting there. And I know that a lot of Penn State fans aren't particularly happy with what they're getting there as that hybrid type guy. So does that mean taking Daquan Hardy out of the equation? Does that mean switching from maybe a 3 safety defense to that 3 linebacker defense? Or do you just have Jonathan Sutherland play all those roles? He's smart enough to do it. I mean, he's obviously a guy that's been around for a long, long time, but is he athletic enough? He's going to be in the right spots and things like that. That's the big question. So I don't know how they're going to pull that off. I'm a big fan of Hardy. I think he can go in there and be. And it's not fair to say or to compare Jonathan Sutherland and Hardy because they're two different body types, they're two different athletes and things like that. But one is a hybrid of two positions, the other is a hybrid of another two positions. But if he's going to be your fifth guy in the secondary, you can work around that. You can make that happen. So be very interested to see how they handle it. I don't know what the right call is. You got to have Jacobs on the field. You got to figure out how to work around that Mike situation and get all those guys the reps possible, and then figure out with Sutherland and figure out if Jamari Budden can play as well, because you've got plenty of questions there, and you got to keep those guys healthy. I mean, you got what, seven scholarship linebackers at this point, getting a little thin there, and you'd like to see the best way to work around that. And as we know, working around things is not the ideal plan of action for this team. They want to be able to work with things and play on those strengths, and I don't know that it's there yet.
Franklin noted that Sutherland, quote, gives us the best ability to get our best 11 guys on the field. He also shortly thereafter talked about in 2022 modern football, what you're looking for defensively, you're probably leaning towards a defensive back with linebacker traits than vice versa, a linebacker with defensive back traits. And that's what we heard about Curtis Jacobs early on in his career, played some safety at the high school level, of course, excelled across the field. Just a quick note on him. He's one of those guys, I mentioned this to you coming off the practice field, just looks different than last time we laid eyes on this team. I know that was in January, so I'm maybe getting ahead of myself. He's looking like a box linebacker, though, Sean. And a couple of years ago, I wondered if that's where he would head. He looks the part here in year 3. I will say that.
Yeah, he looks good. He's at the front of the line, which is, his personality has grown into that more than anything. And plus, you had guys like Ellis Brooks and Brandon Smith and those veteran presence ahead of him, and he had to sit back and watch those guys lead and figure out how he can be the best leader, how he can absorb all that and be the best leader of himself. And I think we're starting to see him turn that corner to go with his physical gifts and to go with where he's at. Now, he's going to have to step up and play in a little bit more traffic. He's going to be a little bit different situation, but I think he's a talented kid. I think he can handle it. And it's good to see him where he's at, I think, becoming a team leader rather than just a position leader guy.
We've talked about some takeaways from what we saw here at team practice. One thing that popped up today, though, Sean, unrelated to the roster, another addition in an analyst role. Penn State's had some notable ones this offseason, and a former head coach at the FCS level.
Yeah, Danny Rocco, former Penn State letterman, is now a Penn State analyst. They've added some guys in this position or in a similar position in an off-field role that you can sort of work with some players and maybe even do some recruiting and things like that. There's different rules for different guys, but adding Rocco to guys like Dan Connor and you mentioned Charles Walker coming back, that staff continues to get bigger and bigger. James Franklin was asked about that today, and it's kind of keeping up with everything that they're trying to do with the rest of college football. And to add a letterman is a bonus. He talked about adding Alan Zamitis to the recruiting team and how that kind of changes some things. You don't have that connection with Franklin. I know he's a Pennsylvania kid, but you never had the Penn State connections with him. So adding any sort of connection with Letterman and to the program's past, I think can really benefit, because that's I don't want to say a blind spot, but that's an area that's just he didn't have to deal with or he hasn't had to deal with here. So bringing in guys like him, bringing in guys like Dan Connor, you can get a little bit sort of that perspective from inside the house.
Yeah, that's one thing Franklin pointed to with some pride today, was saying some of the lettermen that they brought in during recent off seasons, and Connor, of course, one of the headliners coming in here 2022. Sean, along with the activities on the practice field, it was a busy recruiting day on campus, as you reported this morning. Players coming and going these days at Penn State.
Yeah, it's a spring recruiting weekends or spring recruiting days. So weekends, weekdays, you're going to have guys pop up. Tyreek Blanding was on campus today, the defensive tackle from New York City. Christ the King actually had about 15 guys on campus. A couple of other guys in town this week. Ryan Corey is an offensive lineman who just picked up an offer from Oregon, from Pine Richland in Western Pennsylvania. So you're going to have these guys trickle in. It was a fairly busy weekend. Andrew Rapplier was back on campus, the tight end who's committed to Michigan. Brian Doan had an update on him on our message board at Lions 24/7. And the Murphy twins, mentioned them kind of in passing on our last episode. Was waiting for the confirmation that they were going to make it to campus, because you never know. But they're committed to UCLA, both defensive ends. Penn State's been recruiting them for a long time. Finally got them on campus this weekend, and sort of sitting back and waiting for a decision, which probably is going to come soon, because they're committed to UCLA. UCLA's quarter starts on Wednesday. There's some academic things to work through from the Penn State side of things, and if they can do that, they've got an opportunity to get those guys on campus for the first summer session coming after May. So I think we'll know something very quickly in terms of the Murphys. Like I said, they have been committed to UCLA, but they decided to take that trip to Penn State to sort of figure out if that's the right call, and figure out if it's the way that they want to swerve here right before enrolling at UCLA. And I think we're going to hear probably something in the next couple of days.
Penn State ended up with a couple of defensive starters out of the transfer portal last year, a couple other contributors on defense out of the transfer portal. To this point, no defensive additions via transfer portal in 2022. You've got Hunter Norzad coming to town on the offensive line later this year, and then Mitchell Tinsley from Western Kentucky underway with spring ball with Penn State right now at receiver. Sean, as you mentioned, a bunch of coverage from today over at lions247.com. Be sure to hop over there for the latest from Penn State spring practice, the transfer portal, recruiting at lions247.com. It's now time to jump into our five-star mailbag, Sean. Brings us a big picture question that's very appropriate for today. Which unit has the most to gain this spring? Offense, defense, or special teams? We like simple questions like that one. Works for us.
Simple questions, complicated answers. But I mean, I think this one's pretty obvious. You got the offense. I mean, I know defense has some work to do with their numbers and their depth and things like that. But offense, they just flat out did not score enough points last year. I mean, you can take all the deep dives and everything you want to do, but they didn't put points on the board. And when they don't put points on the board, they don't put wins in the win column, then you've got issues. So that offense needs to work through some things, especially with the running game. As we mentioned, James Franklin was asked about that before, and it's a total team effort. It's Troutwine, it's Howell, it's Sider, it's everybody. It's Mike Yurcich especially. So that offense, I think the offensive side of the ball, no question to me, has the most to gain. It's about making those strides and trying to figure out what they can do with what they have on campus, especially with that offensive line. But yeah, they're going to have to figure some things out.
There's new coordinators on defense and special teams, but yes, the obvious and right answer here is offense. And I think also you think about what you're gaining. That's through personnel. That's through acclimation with new guys on the roster. That's through finding who's going to fit and who may not this year. And on offense, you added 9 new players in January. Defense, you added 1. So you have a lot more to gain in that aspect. And I think particularly when you talk about the talent as well, a couple of those 5 stars in different rooms, you've had a nice little some speed that has been added to your receiver group. Can you make any of that count here in 2022? Remains to be seen. But I think at the crux of this, you got the Yurcich and Clifford dynamic. But to me, it's a lot more about those pieces that have come and gone. You're saying goodbye to a guy who was the favorite target for the last couple of years in Jahan Dotson. And now you're saying hello to what you figure could be a very valuable weapon right off the bat in Nick Singleton, and maybe the future cornerstone of this program, and a guy like Drew Aller. And by the way, JB Nelson, someone who was factored into the 2 deep today at guard, now on campus. So I think from a personnel standpoint, there is plenty to gain. Although you have the same coaching staff in place on offense, I don't think any of them are pleased with what they put on the field last year. So this spring is just so pivotal.
It was funny looking at because we were talking about newcomers earlier today, and I watched the defense, specifically the defensive line at practice today, and I'm going through my notes and I'm like, Zane Durant's the only one. Like, he's the only guy on defense that you can point to and say, here's a newcomer. But on offense, you've got those running backs. And as we mentioned, running backs can contribute early. You got the quarterbacks that everybody's going to look at and see the shiny objects and things like that. That's really cool. So, yeah, I think the offense, there's no question. And James Franklin, kind of said that on Monday. He was talking about getting the running game going. And if you can't do that in the summer, you're not going to get where you need to get. You can do 7-on-7, you can pass it, you can have your guys work together in the passing game and things like that. But the running game, these 15 practices are of paramount importance. And we know to getting Penn State's offense going, you need to run the football. So it's a very, very important time. You got to cram as much as you can in these 15 practices and get where you need to be, and at least get there mentally, and then hopefully catch up a little bit more physically in the off season. But yeah, I mean, it's going to come down to the same thing. I mean, how many times did we do post game episodes last year? Where people were frustrated with the defense, and we're saying it's not the defense. The offense needs to score points. I mean, it just doesn't get more black and white than that. And obviously there's shades of greater work in there, but at the same time, if you don't score points in this day and age, you're out of luck. And Penn State was able to, or was not able to, convert those close games, those defensive struggles and things like that into wins. And that's what it comes down to at the end of the day.
Practice 1 of the spring, we were on the field this afternoon on a Monday, and mid to late March, and practice 15 will be in Beaver Stadium with all you, hopefully, watching this team, and a lot of these guys making their debut in front of a Penn State crowd. A lot of work to do between now and then. Our understanding is there will be weekly practice access, which we appreciate here. We'll also give you the rundown from press conferences and player calls, expecting to speak with players and assistant coaches over the course of spring ball as well. So fresh content coming your way at Lions 24/7. Of course, right here on the podcast as well. We'll be back with another episode later this week. Sean, anything else to add? We saw a lot today, and I feel like we did a pretty good job covering our bases, but let me know if we missed something.
Somebody will let us know if we missed something, but no, great to see the blue skies. It wasn't quite pads popping today, just had those little shells or whatever, but good to see football back in Happy Valley.
No doubt. We'll be back with another episode later this week. On behalf of Sean Fitz and our producer, Lance Glynn, I'm Tyler Donohue. This is the Lions 24/7 podcast.